Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Solomon, and welcome to this webinar. I'll be chairing the first half of the seminar of the webinar before handing over to Annie, who will chair the second half. We're delighted that well over 200 people have registered for this event. And we want to thank a few people and groups. Huge thanks to Larkin Bloom Library, which is part of Pluto Press UK's National Reading Rooms Network. So thanks to them for hosting us, and also thanks to our co-sponsors, the Edinburgh University Jewish Staff Association and the Doakite Collective. Thanks to Chloe Grandpa and Sam Corey for their hard work to make the webinar happen behind the scenes. I also want to remind people about the fundraiser for Mohammed Abdel Gata Kamel Hagag and his family in Gaza. People can locate the fundraiser in your reminder emails about the event, as well as in the Ticket Tailor sign up that you will have already used if you're here. I just want to note that one of our panelists, Joseph, will just be joining us in about 10-15 minutes, but he is here. If you've come especially to see him, he will be here. Um, so we have four presentations, and we're going to hear them all before moving to a Q&A discussion. There's no chat function in this webinar. Instead, we want to invite questions into the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom pages, and which each of the panelists, all of us can see, and we'll use your Q&A questions, remarks to feed into our discussion at the end. Each presentation of each of the four will be roughly 20 minutes, and we'll be sure to stop no later than 7 p.m. The whole webinar is being recorded for us. We haven't yet determined what the fate of that recording will be. But if you see that it's recording, that is the reason. All right. So I would like to introduce our first panelist, Tal Hever-Chybowski, who will speak on the devastation of Gaza, historical perspectives of a Yiddish poem. Thank you so much, Tal.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers of this event, Ben Rogaly and Annabel Gottfried Cohen, and the facilitators and supporters of this event, in particular Sam Corey, Chloe Grandpa, and Professor Sam Spiegel. Thank you very much. I am a scholar of Yiddish, but I speak to you today mainly as the author of Churban Azeh, The Destruction of Gaza, a Yiddish poem whose title also mysteriously found its way into the title of this event. First, I would like to read the poem to you in Yiddish, and you can follow both the original and also David Foreman's English translation on the screen. Inmitten Gräuel verrann a Rege, wenn es glust sich mir, a Reus zu nehmen sich von Klall. Punkt demolt red a Stimm in mir. Wie kennst du leikenen dein Stamm, als Trären auf dein Jingels Back, der Monnen dir in Churban Beis Hamikdash. Wenn Churban Azeh hebt sich on, gefinn ich sich in Guernica. Nicht metaphysisch, nicht figurativ, nur dorten Mamesh, wer Tourist, a frischer Tate mit sein Sohn und mit sein Mammen in an alten Karawan, a vorendiger Heim, wo es ist mehr Erd von alle Länder in der Welt in dem Moment. In Telefon der Mond mein Tate mir in Abe Kovners Schure. Guernica auf jeden Bergel. Ungeschrieben hat sie in 1949 wie ein Abruf auf der ersten Nakba. Wir fahren weiter bis auf Meirev. Finistera, Sof von Land. In Karawan, in dem Vermachten, red ich zu der Misrachwand, Also zu sagen, Schmeißoel, in dein Nomen und in meinem tut man das. This is not a poem about Gaza. It doesn't tell the story of any Palestinian. It is a profoundly Jewish poem, written by a Jew about Jewish history and addressing the Jewish people. It was published in January 2024 in the oldest running Yiddish newspaper, the Vorwärts, founded in 1897 in New York, the same year the Jewish Bund was founded in Vilnius, and also the year that the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel. Two paths for the Jewish future, born in the same moment. Two opposing answers to the so-called Jewish question in Europe, a diasporic answer and a colonial answer. One strived for cultural autonomy within a political framework of Doigkeit, while the other advocated for Jewish colonization of Palestine and later for Jewish sovereignty within a modern nation state. As a socialist publication in its inception, the Vorwärts shared a lot of its ideas with the Bund. With time, however, it became increasingly aligned with Zionist views. Today, while very much engaged with pro-Israeli sentiments, it has not completely forgotten its past. And its editor, Ruchel Schechter, also gives a limited space for Jewish radical voices. Due to this complex historical baggage, I felt that the Vorwärts was the right place to publish the poem. The addressee of the poem, as I said, is explicitly articulated in the end as the entire Jewish people. Shema Yisrael, words of the traditional prayer directed not at God, but at Israel, that is the Jewish people, whose very name has been appropriated by a nation state in 1948. To be sure, Israel, in the poem, is not the name of a territory or a state, but of a community, the entire Jewish people. And the poem begins with a personal wish to break from this community in light of the atrocities committed in its name. Inmitten Gräuel voran Rege, wenn es lustig mir rauszunehmen sich von Klal. It's a Yiddish rendering of the famous Hebrew formulation from the Haggadah. Yeah? Hotzi et atzmo min haklal, the words of the evil son, or of the four sons in the Haggadah of Pesach. But it's impossible to do so in light of collective memory, in light of collective history. Wie kennst du Leikenen dein Stamm? Das Trären auf dein jünges Back der Mondir in Chum Besamikdash. Now the place of the poem's plot, the motorhome, articulates its diasporic sensibility. An alter Karawan, a vorrendiger Heim, was is mehr Erd von alle Länder in der Welt in dem Moment. A mobile home, a substitution for a country, a substitution for planet Earth, and a substitution for the synagogue, as we should see, which is in itself a substitution of the temple twice destroyed in antiquity and once in Europe. During the Churm, literally the destruction, the word Jews used for the Nazi genocide before the state of Israel replaced the term with a state-sponsored term, Shoah. In Yiddish, we refer to the destruction of Jewish culture in Europe as der dritte Churm, the third Churm, or Churm Europe, the destruction of Europe. And now a fourth destruction is in the present. Finistera sofun land. But this diasporic sensibility, in which even the eastern wall of the Ashkenazi synagogue becomes a relative and ever-changing place marker, literally changing at every turn of the motorhome, even this caravan shut tight cannot protect its inhabitants from collective responsibility for the destruction of Gaza, from the genealogy of trauma which continues to unfold passing from father to son again and again and again. And you see here all the father and son in the poem. Even the name Abba Kovner, the word Abba also means Hebrew in Hebrew, in rabbinical and modern Hebrew. The poem travels through space and time from 586 BCE and 70 CE, the respective dates of the two destructions of the temple in Jerusalem, to 2023, as the destruction of Gaza begins. From Guernica to Finisterre, the cities in northern Spain, where the poem was written. From Yehuda Halevi's medieval Spain to the Spanish Civil War. From the Nazi genocide of the Second World War to Abba Kovner's reaction to the Nakba in Palestine. These are not comparisons. These are the layers of Jewish memory that the poem moves through, that move me as I write it. Indeed, the poem explicitly rejects all metaphorical and figurative language. Nit metaphysisch, nit figurative. The only metaphor in the poem, a Guernica on every hill, is a quote from Abba Kovner, a survivor of the Churban, a Jewish partisan, a Yiddish and Hebrew poet, and a member of the group Nakam, who after the war sought to avenge the killing of 6 million Jews by poisoning German water reservoirs. Kovner wrote this line in 1949 in response to what he witnessed during the war of 1947-1948. And it is Kovner, not I, who compares the Nakba to a Guernica on every hill, referring, of course, to the destruction of Guernica by the German Luftwaffe in April 1937. I presented this poem at the 2025 International Oral History Conference in Krakow together with my colleagues who will speak today. Speaking there, I said the following, quote, reading this poem in Yiddish here in Krakow, where a third of the population spoke Yiddish, the language of 5 out of 6 million victims of the Churban, 50 kilometers away from Auschwitz, is significant symbolically, culturally, historically. But it is not an invitation to comparison. To compare genocides is to normalize them, whereas the term genocide was coined precisely in order to fight its normalization in human history. Sorry, not that. Writing Churban Aze in Guernica and juxtaposing layers upon layers of destruction is not an invocation or comparison, but an invitation to protest, to subvert war propaganda and the justification of mass atrocities. If the atrocities of October 7th as a date concept, October 7th, right, like September 11th, if these atrocities are utilized to justify mass starvation, forced displacements, the targeted and untargeted killings of tens of thousands of people, if not more, then let us reclaim this date and remember also October 7, 1897, the day on which the General Jewish Labor Bund was founded in Vilnius. No comparison, no replacement, but a juxtaposition of time and space that might give us the force to resist narratives and symbols of state mass violence. 2 years have passed since I published this poem. I have come to realize that besides all of the motives I described here, it also articulates another personal, emotional theme, that of isolation and loneliness. The poem was partly written as a reaction to a deep feeling of loneliness. After October 7, 2023, I felt I had lost the overwhelming majority of my friends. People whom I considered political partners turned on their beliefs and made statements, some personal, some public, in support of the attacks by the State of Israel in Gaza. In particular, the phenomenon of Israeli leftists who proclaimed that they had been wrong became so widespread, wrong being leftist, yes? It became so widespread that a Hebrew term was soon coined for these individuals, mitpakchim, those who sobered up, as if ideals of solidarity, humanism, and the fight against apartheid and colonialism were the result of a kind of drunkenness from which one finally awakens. My choice to write this poem in Yiddish was partly due to my great disappointment with the people I could reach in my native Hebrew. Yiddish became the only language in which I was able to articulate this pain while imagining a readership that could relate to it. While the publication of the poem did bring about dozens of warm reactions from Yiddishists around the world who felt the poem articulated their own feelings, the aftermath of its publication put me at odds with the Yiddishist community of Paris, in which I had played a major role for a decade. All of a sudden, the loss of the land, Finisterre, was joined by an agonizing feeling of the loss of my local community within Yiddishland. Nevertheless, as the poem articulates, I cannot leave the klal, the community, neither in the sense of Judaism, nor Yiddishkeit, nor Yiddishland. Wie kennst du Laken and dein Stamm? But the feeling of isolation, of having lost my group of reference, has haunted me ever since. Today's event, for which I am very grateful, will certainly not impact the supply chains of international arms deals and diplomatic legitimization which enabled the genocide in Palestine. But it might make some of us, or at least myself, feel less isolated, less alone. And this, I think, is not just psychologically, but also politically very significant. For us to feel isolated, marginalized, and depressed is precisely what the transatlantic alliance of capitalism and racism wants, as it pushes for passivity and resignation. To be in a room together, not just social media, but here, even in this virtual room, to speak and to listen to one another enables us to remain active and to come out of silence. Thank you for being here and in such unusually high numbers for an event of this sort. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tal, for that wonderful presentation. For everyone who's here, just a reminder that we are going to do our Q&A at the end after all four of the presentations. So if you'd like to put in questions now into the Q&A, feel free to do so, and we'll be collating them. So yes, our next panelist is Annabel Gottfried Cohen, who will speak on Jewish volunteers in the international brigades, nationalism and anti-Zionism on the Yiddish communist left. So I will now hand over to Annie.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to jump straight in because I spent most of my day trying to shorten this presentation, and we'll see how I do. It's a very big topic. I'm going to be speaking really to the topic of collective memory and collective history, which Tal has already brought up. And in my research on this topic, this is my PhD topic, or part of it. I think in part came about through my own search for an alternative collective memory or collective history that I grew up with. I grew up with a very, I think, standard Zionist narrative of Jewish history that was very centered around the Holocaust in which I grew up knowing that many of my own family members had perished. And it was also very much centered around support for the state of Israel. And I think my interest in the international brigades actually began with my search for different narratives. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that, about in a way, this presentation is going to be a bit of a plea for good history. Um, and because I know that I'm not going to be able to talk about everything I want to talk about, here are three things that you can read if you want to read in more detail about the topics I'm going to touch on. Um, so the International Brigades, for anyone who doesn't know, were a military force. They were part of the Spanish Republican Army, founded in the autumn of 1936 by the Communist International to fight on behalf of the Spanish Popular Front government against a military coup that had been launched by a group of conservative rebels with the support of Spanish fascists and very quickly also with the support of Hitler and Mussolini. So the Spanish Civil War started as a Spanish conflict between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary Spanish forces and very quickly became a conflict of global dimensions that has been remembered as the prequel to World War II. This was where Nazism and communism clashed, and it's remembered as the big fight also between fascism and democracy. Um, and in the international brigades, in this essentially communist army, there are lots of debates around this, but I think that the international brigades should be characterized as a communist force. They were led by communists. The majority of the volunteers were communist, although there were also non-communist volunteers. There was a very high proportion of Jewish fighters. It's estimated that around 10% of the international brigades were Jewish. Which is quite a startling number based on kind of Jewish population sizes in the various countries that those volunteers came from, but it's not such a surprising number. It corresponds quite well to Jewish membership in the communist parties of Europe and America. Um, and when you read about the history of Jewish volunteers in the international brigades, the narrative that you tend to get straight away is that this was the first example of Jewish resistance against the Nazis, Jewish resistance against the Holocaust. And this is the narrative that drew me into studying this topic. In fact, I wanted to write about Jewish leftists, Jewish anti-Zionists, which I'm going to talk about, who went to fight back against the Nazis and who fought for Jewish survival in Europe as an alternative to this story of kind of fighting for a Jewish future in Palestine that I had grown up with. There's one of the books that I pointed to at the beginning of this talk, Gerben Zagsma's History of the Jewish Volunteers in the International Brigades, talks about this narrative and about how it really developed out of debates around Jewish passivity in the Holocaust, supposed Jewish passivity in the face of the Holocaust in the kind of late 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And it's a kind of, and I would agree with him, an ahistoric narrative that actually obscures much of what was a very specific history of not a Jewish, I think it was a Jewish national movement, actually. I think that, but it wasn't, we can't talk of this as a history of Jews as a whole. This was the history of the Jewish communist left. In part, it's a very important history of the Yiddish communist left. The international brigades are somewhere where Yiddish-speaking communists managed to establish Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews as one of the peoples represented in this big multinational proletarian army, and that's a very exciting thing. And of course, there were also many, many Jews who fought in the international brigades who may not have really identified so much as Jews. They had Jewish origins, but for them, they were communists and socialists who saw themselves mostly fighting for a political cause. And this idea that the fight in Spain was a fight of resistance against the Holocaust ignores the fact that the Holocaust hadn't started yet. And one thing that I think presenting this way obscures is it obscures our ability to see how resistance against fascism actually developed. Another thing it obscures is the solidarity that was expressed between different peoples who were all being threatened by fascism. Actually, in 1936, it wasn't so evident that Jews were going to be on the front line in the way they eventually were. That became more evident as the war goes on. And this very simple narrative obscures a lot of that. And it obscures a lot of the specificities of the politics, the ideology, and the political future that people who fought in Spain were fighting for. This is just one example of the Yiddish poetry that was inspired by the Spanish Civil War, Peretz Markish to Moscow from Madrid. And in this poem, he describes somebody fighting in Spain, fighting against fascism, fighting for this better future. But ultimately, the thing he really dreams about is going to the Red Square in Moscow. And this is an important point, I think, also that the majority of the volunteers and certainly the people who organized the brigades were, as I've said, communists and also Stalinists, and people who very, very deeply believed in the Soviet Union and saw the Soviet Union really as the kind of key to the Jewish future. And it would partly also be disappointment, disillusionment with the Soviet Union that would also change this and lead to this development of another narrative. This narrative of Jewish volunteers in the Spanish Civil War as the first line of resistance in the Holocaust has been particularly important in Israel. This is something that Ra'anan Rain has written about. This is one of the other articles I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Israel also is a place to where a lot of Jewish volunteers moved, Jewish volunteers from Poland in particular after an anti-Semitic campaign in Poland in the 1960s. And so it becomes an important site of debate over what this means, over what the act of volunteering in Spain had meant for Jewish volunteers, at the same time also as the Shoah is becoming very central to Israeli national discourse, and this idea that what Israel is fighting when are fighting Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, that what they're actually fighting is the kind of continuation of this long history of anti-Semitic persecution that peaked with the Nazis and the Holocaust. And I think we've really seen this narrative in the past 2 years of genocide in Gaza. So in the 1930s, actually, the Jewish volunteers who went to Spain from Palestine were largely regarded as deserters by the Yishuv. They were regarded as kind of traitors who, maybe traitor is too strong a word, but certainly deserters who were ignoring the work of fighting Palestinian resistance in Palestine and fighting to build a Jewish presence in Palestine, and were instead going back to Europe to fight in what was, seen partly as a communist cause, as a leftist cause. There certainly was a lot of sympathy for Republican Spain within the Jewish world, and that included Jews in Palestine, but they did not support people actually going over there to volunteer. And there's a film about this called Madrid Before Hanita by an Israeli director, Aaron Tobiner, which I recommend watching. It's a very romantic film. And this, in Israel as elsewhere, from the late 1960s onwards, the Jewish veterans start to be assimilated into this kind of national Zionist narrative of Jewish resistance to the Holocaust, which, as I've said, is also part of a narrative of like ongoing struggle that the Israeli continued occupation and continued suppression of Palestinian resistance is also portrayed as a continuation of this resistance against anti-Semitic persecution. And I was very struck by this when I visited Yad Vashem, by which time I was already studying European Jewish resistance movements, and noticed that at the end of this exhibition on the Holocaust, which this huge, monumental exhibition, obviously extremely disturbing to go through, and the resistance movements are portrayed at the end. And at least when I visited, they started playing Hatikva in the background, and so you get this immediate kind of wedding of resistance against the Holocaust with Israel and with the IDF. Raanan Rain has also written about the way that some international brigade anthems have been translated into Hebrew with slightly different lyrics and sung in the IDF as a kind of way of connecting this struggle, this fight against Hitler and Mussolini in Spain with the IDF's occupation of Palestine. I was very shocked to discover that one of the International Brigade songs that I know quite well was sung by the IDF during the 1967 occupation of the West Bank. Um, and as I've said, this kind of simplistic narrative does a lot of things. It obscures a lot of things in what is in fact a very complex history. One thing that it obviously obscures is the anti-Zionist politics of a lot of the Jewish volunteers in Spain, and particularly the Jewish volunteers from Palestine. Actually, there were a few Zionists who did volunteer to fight in Spain, but the majority who went over to Spain from Palestine were communists. Many of them had actually been expelled from Palestine by the British authorities for their communist activities. And you can see here, this is from Raanan Rain's article, but actually quoting an interview that Aaron Torbiner carried out. One of the volunteers explicitly linking his decision to volunteer in Spain with his disillusionment with what was being done in Palestine. I saw how the Arabs who lived there in Palestine were exploited. What troubled me the most was the fact that we tried to take over jobs that were traditionally theirs. And I want to share a letter that I found in my own research for a recent chapter about American volunteers. This is a young man called Paul Siegel. He was a communist who grew up partly in the kind of Yiddish communist movement in New York. He spoke Yiddish, although he wrote back to his family in English. And he writes back here from Spain, telling his mother about a group of Jewish volunteers from Palestine that he's encountered in the international brigades. And he writes, there are a couple of fellows here who have just come from Palestine. These fellows have been in Palestine since the beginning of the Jewish colonization there. They were just expelled from the country because of their political convictions, namely being communists. Chauvinism towards Arabs is greater than that of Hitler's Germany towards the Jews. This is in 1937. There is not a single Arab in Tel Aviv. No Arabs are permitted to work for Jews. If a Jew and an Arab are seen walking together, both are punished, though the Arab is punished much more severely than the Jew. No Arabs are allowed in the Jewish trade unions. From what those fellows said, it is evident that the alliance of the immigrant Jews in Palestine with British imperialism is splitting any front that both the Jewish and Arab workers might form against British imperialism. It seems inconceivable to me that the Jews who are experiencing such terrific chauvinism in Germany, Poland, etc., should not see how such actions split and disrupt the power of the working class, especially when fighting such a powerful enemy as fascism or British imperialism. You can see here very clearly his communist politics. But this is really interesting. I mean, this is an important source. All of these sources are important. This is something that challenges immediately the narrative that I was grown up with, that I grew up with, that Palestine firstly was a land without a people, and then, if there were people there, they weren't, they didn't identify as a people. You know, this letter clearly challenges these, very basic Zionist tenets. But it's also interesting, I could take this letter and I could use it to argue a different, very simple narrative that the Jewish left has always been on the right side of history, that the people who first went and fought against Hitler were also the anti-Zionists who were fighting against the Jewish occupation of Palestine. And the reality is a lot more complicated. This kind of source, at least in my own research, I found to be quite rare. This expression of solidarity with Palestinians, of protest against what is being done to Palestinians. is quite rare. And actually, we can kind of see this even in the letter itself, because Paul seems to be writing back to his mother, who is, as far as I know, or was a communist. At least she is enough aligned with communist politics to send both of her children to communist summer camps and to the communist Young Pioneers youth movement. And yet he's trying to challenge her ideas here. So this letter also tells us something a little bit about the limits of anti-Zionism, at least in the way that a lot of us would describe it. And I'm using the words very basically, but the limits, let's say, of Jewish solidarity with Palestinians, or even Jewish empathy and understanding of what is happening in Palestine. Um, and we see that also in other figures in Spain. The woman in the top left corner here is Gina Medem, who was one of the kind of foremost Yiddish propagandists working in Spain, a journalist and a spokeswoman. She was remembered as somebody whose words were like thorns in the eyes of Zionists, actually also in the eyes of Bundists. This quote said she was a very, very dedicated communist. And she became a supporter of the state of Israel following the Holocaust and following the Soviet Union's support of the creation of the state of Israel. And this seems to have been the case for a lot of the Jewish communist left, at least, which is not really that surprising, since, as I've said, I haven't been able to go into very much detail, but I do think that at least Yiddish-speaking communists, to some extent, represented a national movement. They were also part of their project was about securing a place for Yiddish and for Jewish culture within the kind of multicultural Soviet Union. And after 1948, Gina Medem, who's a long spokeswoman for Birobidzhan, also becomes a spokeswoman briefly for the State of Israel, and kind of ties these two projects together in a way that might seem quite surprising, but is very interesting. Jonathan Boyarin, in his study of Polish Jews in Paris, actually suggests that the Polish Jews in Paris, being Jewish communists, being people who actually organized the Jewish volunteers in the international brigades, at least the Yiddish speakers, that many of them seem to have replaced what was once their belief in the USSR and their vision of the USSR as this kind of ideal Jewish homeland with Israel after the war. And actually, that's one final point I wanted to make, that I see this parallel often in my research. Actually, one of the questions that tends to be asked when you study, or that we tend to ask in the study of the Jewish communist movement in particular, and the communist movement in general, is how people were able to ignore what was really going on in the Soviet Union. The Spanish Civil War, for example, happens at around the same time as the first Stalinist purges. And, elements of that Stalinist paranoia are brought to Spain and to the persecution of the Spanish left, the Spanish anti-Stalinist left. And whereas a lot of people do leave the party over this, not everybody does. And trying to understand that actually growing up with kind of surrounded by Zionist politics and by this kind of what would often seem like quite a blind support for the state of Israel, helps me to understand this. And I see a parallel. I'm not making a comparison between the Soviet Union and the state of Israel, lehavdil, but in this kind of difficulty or refusal to see when a dream, a political dream, becomes a nightmare. And I'm going to end now. I need to end now and introduce our next speaker. But I guess what I'm trying to argue for, I was attracted to the study of the international brigades, or of Jewish volunteers in the international brigades, because I wanted to find, heroic stories of the Jewish left that might give me an alternative to what I had come to understand as a nightmare, what I had once believed in and, had now fallen apart through my own, interaction with Palestine and with Palestinian history. And I want to make an argument actually for avoiding simple narratives and for good history, because I've actually realized I've ended up studying Jewish Soviet agents who were sent to Spain, sent to Barcelona by Moscow. But there is still so much to be learned, and I think that there's a lot to be achieved simply by challenging historical narratives that are clearly too simplistic and too reductive. And with that, I am seizing the chair and no longer sharing my screen. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Joseph Finlay, who's going to be giving a presentation called Towards an Oral History of British Jewish Engagement with Israel.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks everyone. I hope I can be heard okay. Can everyone hear me okay, my fellow panelists? Yeah, I think so. So I'll just make two preceding remarks before I begin my proper paper. And the first is to say that this initial panel took place at the International Oral History Association in Krakow, and that's why my paper relates to the subject of oral history. And secondly, you'll see this impressive looking scholarly bookshelf behind me. It is not mine, but it belongs to a rabbi, and I'm delivering this talk from the offices of a rabbi in a mainstream synagogue because I was asked to take part in a service beforehand, and I'm enjoying the fact that that is the case because I think many of us inhabit these mainstream Jewish communities in complex ways. We're both within and without, so I thought I'm enjoying this coincidence that I'm here. So, despite the important role oral history has played in British history since the 1960s, it has played only a minor role in the writing of British Jewish history. The oral history work that has been done has heavily been based on refugee experience, particularly with Holocaust survivors. I'm just realising that I need to share my PowerPoint. I actually forgot to do that. I hope everyone can see that successfully. So the existing work has been done particularly with Holocaust survivors, refugee experience. Jewish refugees from the 1930s and 1940s. Sorry. There we are. And those who were given refuge after the Second World War. Much more recently, the project Sephardi Voices has carried out interviews with Jews who emigrated from the Middle East, North Africa and India in the post-war era. The emphasis has always been on the refugees' early lives in their countries of birth and on their migration experience. Their later lives in Britain has received much less focus. There are also some important regional connections. The Manchester Jewish Museum has an important archive of around 530 interviews with Mancunian Jews, and the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre holds 130 interviews with Scottish Jewish community members. Whilst not exactly oral history, there have been some significant surveys. Notable examples include the Edgeworth Survey, carried out in 1968 and 1969 by Ernest Krauss, and the 1978 survey of Redbridge carried out by Barry Cosmin and Carrie Levy under the auspices of the Board of Deputies Research Unit. These surveys were often most interested in changing Jewish demographics rather than the life experiences and views of those surveyed. Their primary aim was to help communal professionals understand where resources were most needed in terms of Jewish schools, retirement homes and synagogues. The questions asked were determined by the researchers rather than by the priorities of interviewees. So that's the broad picture. What about British Jewish engagement with Israel? In the 20th century, Palestine, and subsequently the State of Israel, came to play an increasingly oversized role in the life of British Jews. But there has been very little oral history on the subject, neither on British Jews who chose to make Aliyah, nor those who stayed in Britain, but whose Jewish identity became shaped by Zionism and Israel. In preparing the PowerPoint for this talk, I was struck by how hard it was to find photo evidence of this kind of issue, certainly on the open internet. I think one would have to go into printed archives to find it, which is telling in itself. We can reflect on the reason for this lacuna, perhaps because in the earlier period, British Zionism was quite a limited phenomenon, epitomised by a small number of individuals and institutions who sought to influence the diaspora and induce them to express their Jewishness in more Zionist ways. Oral history would have revealed a less Zionist community than communal leaders and funders wished to admit, so there was little impetus to engage in it. Changes in communal attitudes in the late 1960s were the subject of doctoral research by Jamie Hakim. Hakim conducted interviews with 12 British Jews who lived through the 1967 war, reflecting on their perceptions of it and how it shaped their Jewish identities. He noted that they experienced the run-up to the war as a period of tremendous fear, believing that a second Holocaust could occur should Nasser invade Israel, even though Israeli historians have subsequently shown that there was no such risk.
Joseph, sorry, are you able to speak up a little bit? Because a couple of people have said it's a bit quiet.
I can speak. Yes, I'll try speaking quite loudly and we'll see if it gets too loud.
Thank you.
Prominent British Jewish figures wrote letters in support of Israel in this period, including those like Ralph Miliband and Harold Pinter, who would go on to be anti-Zionist critics of Israel. Because of these fears, the sense of elation at Israel's rapid victory and territorial conquests was all the greater. They were experienced in religious, messianic terms, as if Jews had suddenly been redeemed from darkness into light. Hakim found that in describing this period, his interviewees underwent bodily shifts, from a sense of constriction in describing the run-up to the war to one of release and liberation when discussing Israel's victory. He concludes, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, that Anglo-Jewry underwent a physical change in this period, that the emotional outpouring changed the collective body of the Jews of Britain. Hakim's research holds interesting lessons about researcher subjectivity. He was only able to gain access to his subjects because of his Jewish and Zionist background and the corresponding assumptions the interviewees made about his political views. They assumed he would use the research broadly in support of Zionism. In fact, he drew on them to narrate an anti-Zionist account of the 1967 war and its impact on British Jewry. Hakim argued that 1967 created what he termed popular Zionism amongst British Jews, a new form of identity expressed through social events, fundraising and tourism to Israel, made easier by the recent boom in air travel. It took an anti-Zionist scholar like Hakim to both engage in such oral history and to name this phenomenon, to show there was something new rather than an inevitable part of Jewish history, as Zionists had maintained. To add to such oral histories, I mine my own family's experiences, in ways which are anecdotal, but perhaps illustrative. They all relate to the Hebrew language. My mother, born in Britain to Jewish parents in 1946, attended the Sunday morning religion school at the family's local liberal synagogue. And on the left you can see it in the building stages. She remembered initially being taught Hebrew in the Ashkenazic pronunciation traditionally used in Western Europe. But then, at an unspecified moment, undoubtedly during the 1950s, she remembered being taught that everything had changed. From now on, they were to pronounce Hebrew according to Ivrit, the form of modern Hebrew used in the new state of Israel. And I'm going to demonstrate this through two versions of the prayer Oseh Shalom that I heard growing up. The first in an Ashkenazic pronunciation, albeit with some Anglo vowel changes, something like this. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. And then later, Nurit Hirsch's 1970s melody, Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru Imru Amen. So this was a huge change to how prayers were spoken. What could be a clearer encapsulation of the way that Zionism was nationalising or perhaps even colonising the Jewish diaspora? How did British Jews feel about this change to their ritual, surely on a par with the abolition of the Latin Mass under Vatican II? We don't really know. Apart from my mother, nobody has really spoken about it, or at least nobody has been willing to listen. This is a piece of oral history research waiting to be done while some of the people who went through it remain alive. Fast forward a few decades. I attended the same religion school in the 1980s and early 1990s, and on the right you can see me in the late 1980s dedicating the new synagogue building. We learned exclusively modern Hebrew, taught by Israeli teachers who attempted to school us in conversational Ivrit, the language of the Israeli street rather than the Siddur. The hope was that we would use it in the future, on trips to Israel, and it once got me through the first 3 lines of the conversation on kibbutz. I remember a session where the rabbi taught us shut-up lines we might use on the beach in Tel Aviv, which I cannot remember, and certainly never used. The policy was a clear statement of what the community thought Hebrew was for Israel rather than for the synagogue and the home. It didn't work. We were terrible students, but I think one of the reasons the approach failed was that the everyday Hebrew of Israel was irrelevant to our lives. In fact, I don't recall Israel being discussed much at all. The attempt to nationalise the diaspora, to turn the British Jewish community into a satellite of the Israeli state, had not fully succeeded. The only thing we were navigating was the familial and communal message that we were somehow different to other British people, when, as far as we could see, we were much the same. This shift to having Hebrew taught as a spoken language by Israeli teachers also remains unstudied. I once spoke to a former religion school head teacher, and she suggested that the change had occurred after 1967, which feels plausible. Still, there is so much we don't know about how students responded to this policy, and whether the attempt to build a stronger connection to Israel worked any better in other places than it did in my synagogue. The late 1960s does seem to have been a moment of transition, but I think we also need to appreciate the era of hegemonic communal Zionism had an endpoint, or rather several points of decline. The first was the 1982 Lebanon War, particularly the Sabra and Shatila massacres, for which Israel was indirectly responsible. This led to a wave of British Jewish protests and dissidents, most notably the establishment of a Peace Now group in the UK, in parallel to its creation in Israel. The hegemonic consensus of popular Zionism began to break down in the wake of evidence of Israeli war crimes and the emergence of a strong anti-war movement in Israel itself. This breakdown continued in the late 1980s with the outbreak of the First Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza, a largely grassroots non-violent movement which the Israeli army put down with brutal force. In this period, the previous taboo on meetings with the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, began to dissipate in Britain, as figures as diverse as the Jewish Socialist Group, Board of Deputies Senior Representative June Jacobs, and Liberal Rabbi David Goldberg all met with PLO reps in the face of opposition by communal leaders. There were a range of Jewish-Palestinian dialogue groups in Britain, both privately in the run-up to the signing of the Oslo Accords and more publicly after it. It will be tremendously instructive to hear how Jewish participants were affected by such dialogue, but almost none of this has been studied as part of oral history. Following this 1980s shift, the Oslo peace process saw a new era of British Jewish attitudes towards Israel as the work of the Israeli new historians became known in Britain, and Palestinians became less feared. This change was one factor which contributed to a tremendous optimism and creativity amongst British Jews in the 1990s and early 2000s. Following 9/11, 2005 terrorist attacks, and a series of wars between Israel and Hamas from 2007 onwards, attitudes hardened once again, and views on Israel returned closer to how they had been in their 1967-1982 heyday. But it was not the same. Popular Zionism had broken down, and younger generations, especially those who came of age after 2001, had not inherited the instinctive fears of annihilation and feelings of redemption that those who remembered the events of the late 1960s and 70s had undergone. Once again, these voices have not been heard in oral history research, but Robert Cohen has recently completed a doctoral thesis based on interviews on journeys towards Palestinian solidarity amongst British Jews in their 20s and 30s. In the place of oral history, one alternative way that British Jewish experiences have been recorded are through anti-Semitism statistics. Since 1994, British Jews have been able to submit their experiences to the Community Security Trust, CST, so long as those experiences can be understood under the category of anti-Semitism. But their voices are barely recorded in the reports that CST creates. Most reports are collated to give total figures for each of the CST's categories of anti-Semitic incidents, so the submissions simply become source material for statistics. A few voices are quoted, but those chosen tend to be the ones that have had the worst and most shocking experiences. The voices of those who were not too upset by their experiences, or who did not experience any anti-Semitism at all, are absent from these reports. This is relevant in understanding the history of British Jewish attitudes to Israel, because sometimes anti-Israel protests have been collated as anti-Semitic incidents, and anti-Semitism work is often Israel advocacy by other means. The other major way British Jewish voices are heard is through surveys carried out by the charity Jewish Policy Research, JPR, which began conducting these around the millennium. The questions are set by JPR, limiting their value as oral history, and once again the primary aim is to create statistics. How many Jews engage in key observances? How much do they participate in the community? And so on. In the last decade, the surveys have focused more on attachment to Israel and to its political decisions, a trend which has increased since October 7th. They have picked up a significant decrease in the number of British Jews identifying as Zionists, and an increase in the number opposing Israel's policies in Gaza and the West Bank. Were there to be significant uncontrolled interviews conducted amongst British Jews today, it was likely they would show that popular Zionism has largely broken down, the centre has been unable to hold, and the British Jews are increasingly polarised between a non- or anti-Zionist left and a Kahanist right. It is thus unsurprising that no common organisation has been in a hurry to commission such research. Toward the end of this year's survey, JPR asked a group of questions about feelings. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? To what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? And overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? I have no idea what JPR hopes to do with these answers. I can only speculate they are expecting a high degree of negativity in response to them, which can then be presented as Jewish trauma in the wake of October 7th and the apparent rise of anti-Semitism since then. Jewish diaspora emotions are relevant, but only when they can be utilised to support certain narratives around anti-Semitism in Israel. Even better, if they can be used as evidence by the British state to crack down on protest and non-violent direct action. So, where does this all leave us? It shows that the relative absence of oral histories of British Jews' approach to Israel is political, born of a communal unwillingness to show how new and different the popular Zionism movement of the 1960s was, and how much disintegration and change has occurred since then. It is in the interest of those who think things can be otherwise that Zionism's support for Israel does not emerge organically from Jewish identity, but must be constantly produced and reproduced, to engage in more such oral history, to amplify the voices of ordinary British Jews and show how they have navigated this complex terrain. We need a British Jewish history from below, to interrogate the ways in which Zionism colonised the British Jewish community, as well as colonising historic Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I want to remind everyone attending that you can put questions in the Q&A if you would like to. And we're responding to some of them as we go, and we'll be responding to more of them at the end. We're gathering them. So if you haven't had a response, you will get one. I'm now going to introduce Samuel Solomon and Ben Rogaly, whose presentation is called Facing the Trouble: Cultural Workers in Yiddish Land, Political Zionism and the Movement for Palestinian Liberation.
Our talk today is a critical exploration of a silence about Zionism and the state of Israel's genocide of Palestinians. The Yiddish land we write about might be expected not to be silent about Zionism, Palestine, or the current genocide. Why not? First, because the historically Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi part of the Jewish world was itself largely destroyed in a previous genocide by the Nazis. Second, because of the history of progressive, often anti-Zionist Jewish workers' movements operating in Yiddish. Our research focuses on Yiddish as a post-vernacular language and culture, rather than as the mother tongue of many Hasidic Jews today. From November 24 until August 25, we conducted in-depth interviews with 20 Yiddish land cultural workers based in the UK and continental Europe. We sought narrators who were at least critical or questioning of Zionism, although we also recognize that people's relationship to political ideologies changes over time. We interviewed 9 men, 10 women, and 1 non-binary person, ranging in age from 25 to over 80. In quoting from the interviews, we'll refer to the narrators by number so they remain anonymous, except for those who requested us to use their real names. In the next section, we'll briefly summarize some of the different routes that the narrators took to becoming Yiddish land cultural workers. Then we'll go on to critically explore the silence in Yiddish land spaces before drawing the presentation to a close with some analytical reflections. Routes into Yiddish and Yiddish land are diverse and often overlapping. We'll briefly mention 3 here. First, for some of the narrators, Yiddish was not simply chosen, but rather something they had heard at home. Septuagenarian British writer Michael Rosen remembered the sudden impact of his mum telling him and his brother that Yiddish was her first language. Badoing! He said his later decision to learn Yiddish was based on an empathetic curiosity. A few years older than Rosen, translator Barry Smerin told us his English-born parents didn't speak Yiddish to each other, but he would nevertheless hear Yiddish words at home. To his mother, a saucepan was always a fendel, a bowl was always a schissel, a rag was always a schmatter, and so on. Narrator 4, who both taught Yiddish and was involved in Yiddish cultural projects, was perhaps over a decade younger than Smerin. The idea of a Yiddish revival made no sense to her, given that she had grown up speaking it at home. Second, for some other narrators, there had been a journey to Yiddish, and it came through music. Singer-songwriter Daniel Kahn described how the realization that he had to learn Yiddish came suddenly. He said, "When I went to Klez Canada," that's one of the major klezmer revival spaces, "I was totally floored. It was like a Damascene moment. There was this interdisciplinary, intergenerational, radical creative movement that embodied many of the values that I found in other non-Jewish cultural scenes, punk rock, folk music, New Orleans street music, theatre scenes, and so on, that gave me an in." Composer and musical performer Paulina Shepard grew up in Tatarstan in the Soviet Union, turning 17 in 1990 around the time of Perestroika. In her words, "Yiddish was just love at first sight. I went to a concert in Kazan. I came out of the concert dancing, and it was fantastic. Not just that, the audience it felt like my people." Shepard later became part of a global community of klezmer musicians. She recalled, "We were in the same place with knowing Yiddish, basically zero. We were all discovering something. It felt like finding your home after not knowing you even had it." Third, some, as we'd expected, came to Yiddish through politics. In the 2010s, a group of UK-based left-wing Jews in their 20s and 30s set up the organization Judas, which created birth wrong trips to travel to sites of Jewish diasporic culture that were not in historic Palestine, mimicking the Zionist birthright trips. Judas activists, now in their late 30s and early 40s, spoke to us about their time in the organization and what made them start learning Yiddish. One of them, narrator 2, traced the specific impetus that got him to start learning Yiddish to Judas and to Bundism, a progressive and for a large part of its history anti-Zionist Jewish workers' movement and ideology. Narrator 12 became involved in Judas around the time of the Israeli attacks on Gaza in 2014, and through Judas met a small number of others who were learning Yiddish before going on to study it herself. Narrator 8 joined Judas a little later, telling us that it opened up a new world to me of diasporism, non-Zionism, anti-Zionism, Yiddishism. Indeed, going back further in time, the Jewish Socialist Group, which was mentioned by Joseph, had, since at least the 1980s, in David Rosenberg's words, been both promoting Yiddish culture and injecting Bundism into the group and rejecting Zionism, not only for what it does to the Palestinians, but also the harm it does to Jewish life. Yet for some, an initial attraction to Yiddish could be followed by disillusion, as narrator 16 in his 30s observed. He spoke of a sort of realization, often amongst newer learners, of like, wait, shit, there are people that study Bundist songs. Okay, they don't like what Israel's doing now, but they're Zionists. How could that possibly be the case? And you're like, yeah, loads of Zionists were socialists. On the other hand, 20-something-year-old narrator 14 emphasized that they were, his words, never attracted to Yiddish as a sort of alternative to Israel or Zionism. In sum, Yiddish has drawn people to it for a mix of reasons. For some, though not all, the politics has been about seeking a way of being Jewish that is not Zionist. In the next section, we begin to explore the silences often found in Yiddish land spaces over Zionism, Palestine, and the current genocide. Yiddish land spaces often contain a variety of political perspectives on these questions. Septuagarian author Ellen Galford, who was part of an advanced Yiddish class, told us, her words, "We kind of touch on the topic, but I think it's an agree to differ thing in a way. The Yiddish class in general is like the family where I grew up, and cousins, uncles, aunts, and the older generations with a lot of different opinions, but you somehow all loved each other and you were thrilled to be together at Passover. It hasn't split us up, and I think we treasure this class so much." This echoes a theme that shows up across most of the narrator's accounts, a sense of the preciousness and precarity of Yiddish land spaces. For narrators located in places with fewer Yiddish speakers, the priority of preserving any particular Yiddish space seems to be all the more vital. While this might suggest that silence about Zionism, Palestine, and the current genocide is a result of deliberate suppression, other narrators suggested that silence might be entirely unremarkable. But even among narrators who were inclined to think in this way, over the span of time in which we conducted the interviews from November 24 to August 25, this perspective was becoming less tenable as Israel's genocide in Gaza, along with the intensified state and settler violence in the West Bank, continued to unfold. It seems clear that something changed over the months of doing interviews. Narrator 10, for example, noted this shift after decades of teaching Yiddish. She said, "If you had asked me before 7th of October, if you had presented me with this project, I would have said, this has nothing to do with me, really. In general, I would have said, my teaching of Yiddish has nothing to do with Israel. The two are unconnected. Now, I don't think that, actually." The sense that some kind of conflict was increasingly likely to break out was shared by narrator 15, who has experience organizing both Yiddish language immersion and Jewish cultural spaces. She said, "I oscillate between being like, we need to be able to talk openly about these things and have open disagreements, and being like, if we did deal with it, we wouldn't be able to look each other in the eyes." Narrator 2 spoke of a third alternative, the possibility of creating separate Yiddish land spaces for anti-Zionists. Taken together, all this raises questions about what Yiddish land spaces are even for in the first place, which we will return to in our conclusion.
Yiddish land spaces are, for most of the narrators, not simply a personal or social activity, but a significant source of income. For workers, the cost of conflict or confrontation could also refer to the literal monetary cost of work lost because of speaking out against Zionism and genocide. In other instances, workers referred to the moral or existential cost of maintaining silence when their conscience would propel them to speak out. In August 2024, 10 months into the genocide, there was a confrontation at Class Canada between people using the keffiyeh as a symbol of solidarity with Palestinians and another participant producing a large Israeli flag. Narrator 20, in their 30s, who was there, reflected, her words, "If Class Canada, for example, doesn't manage to get some more funders, I don't know the details, but I think it's an unstable situation, basically. In Europe, there's funding for Yiddish culture motivated kind of from philo-Semitism. And in North America, that capital is falling away because the younger generations don't have that kind of capital." Our fellow panelist, Tal Hever-Chybowski, was interviewed for the project. He's published about his views on Gaza and told us about work opportunities he's lost as a result. Conversely, Tal also thought he may have gained some work opportunities because, in his words, people who have the possibility to invite speakers and teachers approached me, perhaps partly as a way to deal with their own frustration with the position of their institutions. They felt compelled to remain silent, but inviting me was, in a way, their way of restoring a sense of agency in a context of self-censorship. Tal was thus understanding about the silence of these others, aptly and jokingly using a Yiddish expression to convey this, a Yid dar choben parnosa, which translates roughly to a Jew or person needs to make a living. Narrator 16 commented on how large Yiddish land cultural institutions' response to the genocide was disillusioning for many younger adults. Naming one institution in particular, he told us, his words, the point that I think revealed some of those dividing lines for young American Jewish Yiddish speakers that had maybe been like latent, that the institution wasn't actually fundamentally a present day radical organization. I think people very much have romanticized that institution, and then they got a sort of rude awakening. Tal Hever-Chybowski explained that in the classroom itself, his approach is intended to be generative rather than confrontational. There was no point in class where I said, this is Tal, okay, we're witnessing a genocide in Gaza. And this is partly because of my rejection of playing the role. Because if you do this and you go to a class and say, okay, I want to divide you into two groups, those who agree with me and those who will probably walk away and never come to my classes again. And then we change basically nothing. So the alternative is not to be silent. The alternative is not to not talk about points of tension, but to bring political context and political topics to class in a way that would be refreshing and challenging to the students. How would that change reality? Just to surround myself with people who agree with me. Hever-Chybowski framed silence as something that prevents change from taking place, but for him that didn't mean that talking about politics in Yiddish spaces requires a pledge of political allegiance. But for most of the narrators, whether silence is broken or maintained, and whether political positions are hedged or approached more directly, the rifts within Yiddish communities over Zionism in general and over Israel's genocide of Palestinians in particular have become unavoidable. If it isn't possible to ignore them, it also isn't desirable for all of the narrators to continue to raise them in these spaces if they feel like dead ends. Narrator 12 expressed this poignantly, saying, for me, it kind of fundamentally comes down to like, I can't watch a genocide happening and not oppose it. If I lose career opportunities, then I lose career opportunities. I don't really want to go to stuff where I think that people might be supportive of this. Like, I just don't want to be around it. In this case, to keep Yiddish land communities together across profound political antagonism would lead a cause rather than to avoid profound pain. The price that narrator suggested might not be worth paying. Before ending, we want to sketch out a synthesis of some of the key political questions that emerge here. The range of perspectives around silence in Yiddish land spaces is intimately tied to what people think these spaces and communities are for in the first place. For the narrators, this is never a simple or single issue answer, insofar as it's tied up for many of them variously with lifelong questions of identity, heritage, spiritual and political purpose, and the communal pleasures of singing, writing, reading, acting, feeling in Yiddish, as well as, for some, their careers. Because of that, there was no single answer among the narrators to one of our animating and underpinning questions. That question being, what is and what should be the relationship of contemporary Yiddish land to the current genocide, ongoing Nakba, Zionism, and resistance to all of these? In their discussion of these questions, we've noticed three interrelated but distinct framings fairly consistently. So the first framing we've noticed relates to whether post-vernacular Yiddish spaces and their participants have a particular moral responsibility to oppose Zionism, or at least to oppose the contemporary genocide. In the second framework, the question is whether these Yiddish spaces and Yiddish culture more generally has a particular epistemological authority regarding contemporary genocide, whether that's the Israeli genocide of Palestinians or in any other context. And finally, the third framework asks whether post-vernacular Yiddish culture can or should have a particular strategic role in organizing to oppose Israeli settler colonialism, and contemporary genocide. So in that first framing, Yiddish as the language of millions of people murdered in the Holocaust has a particular moral responsibility to oppose genocide. For example, Ellen Gottfried made the point using the word churban, which we've heard about already, the Yiddish word for destruction, often used to refer to the Holocaust and other catastrophes in Jewish history. And Gottfried said, for me, the churban is a context, a sort of should know better. It raised my expectations of what one wanted to be the right Jewish morality. In other cases, claims about this moral responsibility also slip over into the second framework, suggesting or implying that Yiddishist or Ashkenazi Jewish opposition to genocide is not only a moral responsibility, but also that maybe it should be prioritized over opposition to genocide by others, or that it has a greater epistemic and moral authority, greater access to the truth than non-Jewish opposition to genocide. Gottfried herself also referred to the pain that comes from seeing the Holocaust used to justify the murder of Palestinians. While not exactly disagreeing with this framing, Germany-based Daniel Kahn reflected on the dangers that come from a focus on moral hypocrisy or the moral duties of Jewish people more generally, although he framed it in terms of worrying about an exclusive focus on this as a core feature of Jewish identity. So his words, something that turns me off about letting anti-Zionism be like a central building block of one's Jewish identity is that it turns what's happening to Palestinians into something that's happening to us. It makes it about us, and it's not about us. There's a phrase here. It's like, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. And so, in this framing, the Holocaust is actually something that happened to Germany. And I want to be careful to emphasize that, like, what's happening to Palestinians is not primarily something that's happening to Jews, simply because it's a moral abyss that a lot of people are falling into in the name of their version of Jewishness. In this instance, Kahn voiced concerns about what happens when questions of moral responsibility slip into the second framework, in which responsibility becomes something like authority, both moral and epistemic. The third and final framework for understanding the relationship between Yiddish and opposition to contemporary genocide is to do with the always context-specific questions of political strategy. When is it useful for Yiddishists to speak against genocide as Yiddishists, or to produce anti-Zionist Yiddish culture, or to encourage Yiddish spaces to take explicit political stances? In each case, who exactly is that being done for, and why, and with what short and long-term strategies and guiding principles? We'll close with the words of narrator 12, who's grappled with what kind of role Yiddish culture making can and should have in political struggle against colonialism and genocide. Her words, I realized that something very radical to do was to admit that I don't actually really have a connection to this land of historic Palestine. It's like actually just not mine. I discovered Yiddish, and this kind of building in diaspora is as important. And I do think this past year, with the onset of what I now believe is a genocide, I've questioned a lot, like, did I make the right choices? In this conversation with us, narrator 12 considered the efficacy of building diasporous Jewish culture as part of the decolonization of Palestine. They question whether their devotion to this task meant abrogating another version of anti-colonial politics. They were, throughout their interview, uncertain about the correct answer to this question. There were at least two distinct approaches to Jewish anti-Zionism expressed here, one in which Jews might be called, like everyone else, to oppose Zionism and to fight alongside others for an end to genocide, perhaps sometimes, strategically speaking, as Jews. The second approach is about the propagation of anti-Zionist Jewish community and life as itself part of a project of decolonization, but one achieved in a more or less separate spheres from struggles led by Palestinians and Palestine solidarity. This approach might preserve or build diasporic Jewish life as an alternative to Zionism, and it also runs the risk of becoming more focused on Jewish lives than on other lives. Yiddish land spaces are uneasily situated between these potentially overlapping, but sometimes conflicting approaches, and the values of silence or speaking out seem to depend on how the urgency of either approach is being felt at any particular time. That's the end of our presentation.